Hi, everyone. Here in the Bay Area, and I had to check, but this is week 10 of shelter-in-place orders, which, as you all know, were put in place by the local and state government in order to slow the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. So obviously, the length of your shelter-in-place will be different depending on where you live, but for me, this is week 10, and let me tell you, just because I've been doing this for 10 weeks now does not mean that it has gotten any easier. The weeks and days are really blending together, and stir crazy doesn't even begin to cover all of the weird stuff that I've been doing just to keep myself busy and to pass the time. But at the same time, I've lately been kind of reflecting on the fact that in one way or another, this pandemic has really upended the lives of just about every single person. For some people, that means that they suddenly find themselves with a lot more free time. And for other people, that means they have a lot less free time. I'm thinking particularly of those who are working essential jobs and who find themselves, with a lot more hours than they maybe wanted or that they feel like they can handle right now. But ultimately, what we all have in common is that we are living through a really unprecedented historic event, and all these big changes in our daily lives, coupled with the extended isolation from our loved ones and a whole lot of uncertainty about how long this thing is going to last and how long we're going to have to kind of live in this new normal, it's all having a really unprecedented impact on our individual mental health. Just kind of as an example of what I mean, the Washington Post reported that one federal emergency hotline for people experiencing emotional distress recorded more than 1,000% increase in calls in the month of April when compared to the same time last year. So that means that that's just one piece of evidence showing that there has been a huge increase in the number of Americans reporting that they're experiencing anxiety and other mental health issues, either more acutely and more often than they usually do, or even for the first time. And personally, I'm just going to be really brutally honest with you guys throughout this whole episode, starting right now. Personally, anxiety is something that I've struggled with for a long time, including long before coronavirus ever came to town. So I feel like this is an important time to be talking about how we can be really proactive and thoughtful as it relates to managing our anxiety and not letting it derail our lives and take advantage of our day-to-day operating. Particularly right now when we're getting a lot of mixed messages from social media, bloggers, influencers, YouTubers, and even plenty of well-meaning friends and family about the ways that we should or shouldn't be adjusting and taking advantage of this time, quote unquote, or taking care of ourselves and our own bodies and brains. And there's just a lot of unwarranted advice out there, is what I'm saying. So all this to say, I think that we would all benefit from thinking really critically and really proactively about what we're doing to take care of ourselves right now and our own mental health. This is Overthinking It. I'm Kaylee Fagan, and this time we're talking about managing anxiety. To help us get a grip on this often intimidating and sometimes really overwhelming topic, I spoke with Dr. Kathleen Smith, who is a licensed therapist and the author of Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. Hi, Kathleen. How are you?
Hi, I'm happy to be here chatting.
Yay, I'm glad. I'm a huge fan of your writing. Just kind of right out the gate, I wanted to start with that. And I wanted to really launch into our interview kind of the same way that you begin your book, which is sort of just by acknowledging that these are some pretty anxious times we're living in.
Yeah, I mean, I thought 2020 might be an anxious year when I wrote this, but I had no idea how true that would be.
Right. I'm curious about your thoughts on that. So, the book really begins with, we live in anxious times. And so I read the book in 2019, and that felt very true then, but I'm sure that must have taken on some new meaning kind of since then.
Yeah, absolutely. And what I always tell people is I think when people hear the word anxiety, they tend to think of it as anxiety disorder or the
Mhm.
diagnosis, but the how I talk about anxiety is that it's this built-in response we all have to things that are scary, whether
Mhm.
they're real or whether they're imaginary. And right now, we are up against something that is very scary and very real. And so it's only natural for us to have that anxious response to it as we figure out how to navigate it, right? And so it's not something that's good or bad. It's just something that is a part of, a challenge or a threat that we have as humans.
Yeah, and, I mean, I'll just speak personally for, myself. That was so powerful to read, just partly because it really felt, very vindicating to have a therapist, a professional, kind of tell me that I wasn't being overreactive, that I wasn't being crazy. Like, there are things to be anxious about, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, we if you think about it, we're biologically programmed to be able to act quickly when something threatens
Right.
us, right? And sometimes that's really great, and then other times it gets in the way of living our lives and solving problems. And so I think the more you can kind of recognize that and accept it as well, this is just part of my DNA, the easier it is to kind of navigate around it if you need to.
And you've already sort of started to touch on this, but I'd also love if we could briefly just kind of explain, I guess, where that line is between like generalized anxiety that everybody kind of experiences on a daily basis, and then the sort of disordered anxiety that folks, need professional help dealing with. Is there a big distinction there?
Yeah, well, disordered anxiety is a description of certain symptoms that people can experience if
Mhm.
they become incredibly sensitive to
Mm.
these threats, real or imaginary, right? I How I describe it in the book is that we all kind of have this alarm system, right?
Mhm.
Built in when we sense danger. And I compare it to like my smoke alarm. I'm not a great cook. My smoke alarm goes off all the time, but I
Mhm.
don't act as if there's a fire every time, right? But sometimes, our brains and our bodies react as if there's a fire, as if there's danger when there really isn't. That sensitivity is just triggered so easily, right? And I think
Mhm.
there are a lot of factors contributing to that. It's our genes, our experiences, our families, all of the above, right? And so I think of it as just kind of a spectrum, right? Some people aren't as sensitive, and then other people are, and they have to, they need a little bit more support. They need a little bit more time to think about it and work on it. But I think, all of us, I say no one is is completely unaffected by anxiety. And I think, it's always useful to think about how it influences your life, your relationships, and what you want to do about that.
In your most recent newsletter entry, you had written that anxiety, quote, can trick us into thinking that we're more capable or less capable than we actually are. And later on, you said that recent anxiety has influenced our perception of reality, our understanding of our own capability to navigate a global problem. And I'm hoping you can expand on that.
Yeah, so I think, what I have observed is just the diversity of reactions that
Hmm.
people
Yeah.
have. And, you stop and you ask yourself, are we all experiencing the same problem?
Right.
Or people who are just hanging out like nothing's going on, like, do they live in the same universe that I do?
Uh-huh.
And I mean, partially that's because we're in different places and
Hmm.
we're at different risk levels and have been given different instructions, right? But I think that we we each have a different response to the anxiety, right? So not gathering data, gathering facts isn't usually our first response. Our response is to avoid it altogether, to try and tell everyone else what to do, right?
Hmm.
To beg everyone else to tell us what to do and to solve it for us, right? There's not a lot of problem solving that happens in that initial anxious reaction. And so I think that's why you get that diversity of responses is we're all trying to do what we know best to calm ourselves down. And that can be useful, but it can also get in the way of actually staying in touch with reality and understanding what the problem is and how to respond to it, right? And so that's something I challenge my clients to think about a lot is, is what you're doing about solving the problem, or is it just about calming you down quickly?
Mm.
And what's the difference between those two responses? Because I think being able to figure out your responsibility, your place in this big problem of the pandemic is a complex thing, right? It's not going to be solved overnight. We can't map out our entire year and know what our lives are going to be like that. And that reality is very uncomfortable because our anxiety wants us to solve problems as quickly
Mm.
as possible and as comfortably as possible, right? So I hope that answers your question.
I think it does, yeah, and I mean, it gets to something else that I'm so curious to get your opinion on, which is, like you said, there's, like, just this absolute plethora of responses, and I mean, one thing that's been on my mind is kind of the variety of ways that folks, w suggest that others, I guess, cope with anxiety or deal with, living in shelter in place orders, live with being in a state of quarantine, and, like, okay, so I'll just be really specific. So there's, like, a ton of messaging from, social media influencers, lifestyle bloggers, YouTubers, journalists about, that this time should be, like a self-improvement opportunity, that folks should be working out, like starting, projects that they've been putting off, hustling, like working harder than they ever have. And then there's lots of like responsive messaging to that saying, actually, this is a terrible opportunity for all of that. And really that taking care of one's mental health and kind of relaxing while we figure all this out is actually the better way. And I guess I'm curious why all the discrepancy, like, and is any of that helpful? Yeah, what are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I think it can be helpful, but I'm biased because I get paid to write things like that.
Mm,
So
fair.
I'm part of that
Mm.
industry, as a writer, as a therapist. But I think, and I wrote my most recent newsletter about this because I was noticing that trend,
Mhm,
the do everything and do nothing responses that have kind of emerged. And to me, that it's not the issue of what you do, it's have you actually thought about it? Are you just borrowing the thinking of your friends or your family or an internet article? Because that's the quickest way to calm you down is just to say, okay, well, this article says I don't have to homeschool my kids. I can let them do whatever. So I'm just going to do that,
mhm,
uh, instead of really thinking about what's important to you right now and what is the best use of your time and that's important work to do, to sit down and ask yourself, what does a good day look like?
mm,
What does good work look like? What does taking care of myself look like right now? And can you be as realistic and objective as you can possibly be, because we tend to overestimate how much work we can get done,
mhm,
especially when we're anxious. And so I think that's one way to respond, is to really say, given this reality, what am I actually capable of doing? How am I going to get myself worked up? How am I going to neglect myself? And how do I want to be responsible for my mental health, my physical health? Right? It's just the act of doing that thinking on your own. It doesn't mean that you can't read advice from experts or ask people what they're doing.
mhm,
It's just when you automatically borrow other people's thinking as a way of managing your anxiety, that you miss out on, kind of being led by your own thoughts and your own values right now.
mhm. Yeah, I remember from the book, and then also I think recently, in the newsletter, you had, mentioned kind of recognizing anxious functioning as it's happening and trying to interrupt that automatic response. But, I mean, that makes sense to me now that I've read your book, but I'd love if you could kind of expand on what that means, that interrupting that automatic response, and kind of how one goes about that for the first time.
Yeah, so I see the work of like just calming down as, first of all, like, not being so hard about your autopilot. What
Mhm,
you do what you normally do when you're anxious, how you've been programmed to respond to things, you know? If your programming is, if you're the oldest child in your family and your programming is to take over and order everyone around when you're anxious, can you kind of just can you laugh at that a little bit? Can you just acknowledge that that's just what you do?
Mhm.
And then, can you be curious and ask yourself, is there a different way? Is there a better way of responding when I feel overwhelmed than, barking at everybody? And then to start to look for those opportunities to interrupt that autopilot and say, okay, here we go. This is what I want to do in this moment. But can I step back? Can I let people be responsible for themselves? Can I not direct everybody? That's going to be super uncomfortable, but maybe that's a useful thing for me to do. Maybe not wasting all that energy would be really good for me. And so I think, the main point of the book is that it comes from a place of curiosity, maybe even a little bit of humor, to be able to laugh at yourself and go, you know what, I always do this and it's not always that effective, and or it leaves kind of a sour taste in my mouth, or I still feel overwhelmed in the long run. So let me just be uncomfortable and
Mhm.
sit on my hands or do something different that feels a little bit truer to the person I'm trying to be. And maybe I'll feel calmer in the long run if I can do that. So I think so much of it is just recognizing what you normally do and not beating yourself up when you do it 9 times out of 10.
Mhm.
Because I think, especially, the more anxious you are, the harder it is to interrupt that. And I think, especially
Right.
right now, with what we're up against, that autopilot is going to be pretty strong, so the small times you can kind of find victory in doing something different, you should definitely celebrate, but it's really hard to interrupt that autopilot.
Yeah, I mean, for me, this was a really challenging concept just because, like, that autopilot has been so powerful in my own life that I think that I've always just sort of believed that my, anxious functioning or tendencies were, a part of my personality or a part of, I don't know, my identity, and, like, the fact that I, react to things the way that I do was, like, a, unchangeable, unsurmountable thing that I was just out of control of and, unhappy with, obviously, but, that it didn't feel like something tackleable, something changeable. So, I mean, do you have any, like, advice for folks who are kind of looking to identify those functions for the first time and who are kind of looking at their own anxiety, with really critical eyes, maybe for the first time?
Yeah, well, I have a couple thoughts. The first is just I could give a couple of examples of
Sure, yeah.
what some of that automatic functioning might look
Mhm,
like. And I talk a lot about this, and everything isn't terrible. But, first thing is just distancing. It's very human to avoid or distance when we feel
mhm.
anxious. And that could be, we're supposed to be physically distancing right now, right? But we don't have to be emotionally distancing from people. But if you start to notice that you have a hard time talking with family members, or keeping in touch with people, if you're avoiding getting back to people, or you're only talking about superficial things like the weather, or I don't know, we can't talk about sports right now, there's no sports,
Mhm.
but that's just something to kind of be on the lookout for.
Mhm.
And you know to think about what opportunities there are to maybe move a little bit closer to people, emotionally at least, and to share what's going on with you and what your challenges are. And to ask yourself, what's a small way I could do that? If I'm not ready to share everything about myself, with my parents, is there a friend or somebody I could reach out to and say, hey, let me tell you about what I've been going through this week, or how I'm doing,
Mhm.
somebody who'd be willing to listen. And so I think just recognizing that it's not an overnight thing. It's not, the self help industry wants us to have this like 5 easy steps, boom, your life is transformed,
Mhm.
right? That's what sells books. But the idea that interrupting your autopilot is a lifelong process, and every opportunity you get to kind of push back a little bit against that anxiety, it is useful to you in the long run. And so I think just starting small can be really helpful for people. For me, I'm a helper, right?
Mhm.
So my thing is like over functioning and doing things for people and trying to control them when I feel anxious,
Mhm.
right? So if I can like refrain from like if my husband and I have disagreements about what knives should be used for what task in the kitchen. It's a very simple, stupid thing,
Sure.
right? But if I can refrain once from saying, "Well, are you sure you wanna use that knife?
Mhm.
Like, maybe the smaller one would be better." Like, that is a victory, right?
Right.
And, it adds up over time, and you realize how big a difference those sort of, little interventions make, if that makes sense. So, I mean, I guess the main message is to go easier on yourself and to look for small opportunities every day to interrupt that autopilot. And if you miss it and you fail, then, try again tomorrow.
Yeah, I'd love to talk even just a little bit more about overfunctioning. Because it was your writing was the first time I'd kind of been introduced to this concept, and I just find it really fascinating, and I think it's one that the listeners kind of this podcast who are, I think prone to be type A's and, do a lot I think they're probably prone to overfunctioning, and so I'd love to just kind of lean in on that idea a little bit and hear more about what that looks like as a anxiety response.
Yeah, so the idea of overfunctioning, it describes a relationship dynamic. So there's not just the overfunctioner, there's somebody who's on the other hand who's underfunctioning,
Mhm,
right? So it's when our relationships kind of end up in the seesaw dynamic that one person, their response to the anxiety is to begin to function for the other person, to be over responsible for them, to do things for them that they can actually do themselves. And the other person, their way of managing the anxiety is to let the other person take over and they become less capable, right? And that doesn't mean that you're either an overfunctioner or an underfunctioner. I think like in my marriage, there are ways that I overfunction and ways that I underfunction all the time, right? But to recognize when you overstep the boundary of responsibility and when you are doing for others, it's not so much about helping them,
mhm,
even though you think that you might be, as it is about calming you down.
right,
So, like, if my I have a toddler, right? So if she is trying to, I don't know, play with some toy and she's getting it wrong or she's gonna, dump it on the floor and make a mess, and I'm feeling anxious in that moment, right? I might take over and show her how to do it or do it for her, right? Whereas that's not actually helping her most of the
mm,
time. That's just about me calming the anxiety that I feel in the moment,
mhm,
or the example I gave with the knives, right? It doesn't really matter what knife my husband uses.
right,
That's just me with whatever stress or anxiety I'm dealing with at that moment. I'm taking over for him as a way of managing
mm,
it. And so I think when people can begin to recognize how much of their daily energy and time goes into functioning for other people, they are shocked.
mhm.
And they start to realize why they don't have as much energy to be responsible for themselves, their own health, their own work. And yeah, like how why they're burnout or tired all the time or resentful that people don't step up more, has a lot to do with the over functioning that they're doing. But stepping back and letting people be more responsible is deeply uncomfortable.
Yeah.
And it's really hard if that's your go-to way of dealing with a problem.
I mean, for right now in particular, I imagine I mean, I can imagine, but also I have lived that experience. I mean, I think right now the temptation to kind of be, really, like, on top of what everybody is doing in terms of, being safe as it relates to the social distancing orders and, like, policing who's going out and who's seeing who. Like, that temptation is so strong, and I think this is a real test of kind of people's, ability to resist overfunctioning, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think an important distinction is that it doesn't, stepping back doesn't mean that you don't share your thinking. It doesn't mean that you don't hold people accountable, right?
Right, fair.
Or express your disapproval if you need to. But it's the difference between, you sharing your thoughts and you trying to control the thoughts of other people or telling them what to think,
Mhm,
right? One is focused on yourself and communicating yourself to them, and the other is focused on trying to control them, right? Which is usually not that effective if we're being
mm.
honest. So I think that it doesn't mean that you shirk away or never share your thinking with people if you disagree, right? But it means that you are acknowledging that they are responsible for themselves
Mhm.
and they are responsible for their own behavior.
Absolutely. I mean, I see the distinction there. I think, like I said, I think it's a hard line to draw for some of us, but,
Well,
um
can I give you another
yeah,
example?
absolutely.
One of the things that I have, some relatives who are less concerned about the pandemic than I am and who are in older and in poorer health, and
Mm,
I was up against this, my instinct was to beg them not to leave the house, right? To
mhm,
argue with them, to lecture them, and I thought about how effective that would probably be, and I realized it probably wouldn't be, and it would just make the relationship worse.
mhm,
So my way of refraining from that overfunctioning was to say, I've been thinking about your situation and if it were me, this is what I would be doing. Or, I think you need to think about how often you want to leave the house
mhm,
or how long you want to take off from work right now. Or maybe talking to your doctor could be useful. And I think that's thinking that's useful without me trying to like cajole or convince them
mm,
to function a certain way, right? And I think that second example is so much it calmer
mhm,
and so much more thoughtful that I think people are less reactive to it, because when you bring your anxiety to that response, people are going to be allergic to it. They're going
mm,
to be reactive. They're going to shut down and hang up the phone or
mm,
start a fight with you, right?
mhm.
And I think you're way more useful to people. You're a better resource to them when you can kind of come at them with your thinking versus that over functioning.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And, to kind of get back to, how folks are going about spending their, or navigating their new day to day, right?
Mhm.
Not so much how they're, trying to balance the safety orders and things like that, but more so looking at how folks are adjusting to a new schedule or trying to kind of fill their days to stay sane while we all wait for things to kinda get back to a more recognizable normal. I do wanna ask, kind of what your take on that debate about if this is a good time for self-improvement, for extra work, or if this is a time for relaxation and, kind of more reflection. I I understand that, like, this is at the risk of kind of adding more, debate to this, but I'm so curious about your take. I can't help but ask.
Yeah, well, I come at it a little bit differently, but I hope that this answers your question.
Yeah.
What I always ask my clients with any dilemma right now, whether it's dating or work or school or relationships, whatever, is to ask themselves, two questions. And the first is, if I were to go about this as anxiously as possible, what would I be doing?
Right.
And if I went through this as thoughtfully as possible or as maturely as possible, what would I be doing?
Mhm.
And I think for some people, trying to accomplish a lot is an anxious response. It's not a thoughtful one. And I think for some people, trying to do nothing and relax is an anxious response and not a thoughtful one. Like avoiding work and hustling can be just as anxious as tackling it and trying to do a bazillion things at once, right? So it's not so much what you're doing as it is the reactivity behind it, if that makes
Mm.
sense. If you've done your best thinking, if you've taken the time to ask yourself what you want to do and what's important to you, and if you can recalibrate when you feel like you've gone off in a weird direction or something hasn't been useful, then you're going to be able to notice when you choose to just relax based on your thoughtfulness or based on your anxiety,
Mhm.
right? And I think because I think people will have different needs on different days. Some
Yeah.
days people are going to want to get up and say, "You know what? I really need to feel productive today. I need to feel like I'm making things happen and I'm solving problems." And then other people are going to say, "Well, I'm just so worked up right now. I'm not going to be useful in any of these tasks. So I need to step back and take care of myself today so that next week I can show up and get a lot done,
Mm.
you know? And so I think if you can recognize how your anxiety is influencing how you choose to structure your day or your week, then it becomes a little bit easier to make the decision. And I think you won't beat yourself up as much when you choose to take a day off and just hang out.
Yeah.
because you're not gonna be going, "Oh, I'm a procrastinator," or "I'm just a slacker right now. I'm not taking advantage of this great opportunity to accomplish all these things." But these are all thoughts that I have daily, by the way. I can strongly relate. Um, and so I think just it's the disparity between, I call it immaturity or maturity, reactivity or thoughtfulness, like, whatever you wanna call it. I think that's the binary that's important.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a perspective that's largely missing from kind of the zeitgeist around this issue. I, and you're right. So many folks have kind of wanted to write the here's the one easy solution that you need to kind of get through this time. And I mean, I'm grateful that you pointed out that people need different things at different times. I know that for myself, and I think for a lot of folks listening, the days like my mood can swing wildly between days or even multiple times a day, and so, that's just really helpful to hear, if that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm
Yeah.
glad.
One other big aspect that comes up in your writing a lot that I wanted to touch on is just you often recognize the importance of embracing uncertainty as a way to cope with anxiety. Do you think you could speak on that as it relates to our current situation?
Yeah, I mean, I think what's so anxiety producing is that we don't have this exact timeline,
Right.
right? It's not like, oh, I can just endure this for 2 months and then this is how life is going to
Yeah.
be. So it's very difficult to make plans for the future. And as I said earlier, our anxiety wants us to have that plan. It wants us to fix things as quickly as possible. And as we all know, as many plans as we have for our lives, we are constantly
Mhm.
experiencing changes to those. So I think the pandemic is unique, but it's not unique in the sense that we're constantly having our life plans turned over
Mhm.
and overthrown, right? Like we've all experienced that so many ways before. And so I think if you can remember that, that's useful to say, you know what, I've dealt with uncertainty before. How did I do it well? How did I not do it well? How do I how do I sit with the discomfort that, this is going to take some time to figure out, that there might be new information or new news every day that's going to change my plan, or that's going to challenge how I've thought about this, right? And so if you can trust that, what I always tell people is any work on yourself does not go, unused. So we can't control, what's going to happen 6 months from now, but you can think about who the person like you want to bring into that future could be
Mhm.
and how like working on yourself now, taking care of your mental health, doing things to manage your anxiety, how that's going to be so useful for you in the long run.
Mhm.
That's what you can focus on, because it's not about knowing what the problem is going to be and how you're going to solve it. It's setting yourself up to be the kind of person who can deal with it as it happens, if that makes sense. And so I think that looks like what we've talked about, taking a hard look at how you respond to scary things and figuring out what you want to hang on to and what's sort of worth losing. That's not a good habit.
I think that's really a beautiful place to leave it perhaps, but, as a kind of maybe a final thought, I'd love to get at, an idea in your book, which is that this work is, like you said, a lifelong practice. It's something that is not done in a week. It's not done, when the pandemic is over, I'd imagine. I'd love to hear kind of what that looks like as a long-term practice.
Yeah, I think, for me it's interesting because I think that I am such an anxious, immature person so much of the time, but I look back on how I functioned a decade ago and I go, "Oh my god, how did I ever get anything done?"
Mhm.
Like how I was such like an anxious little creature, in my 20s, and that's what makes it worth it to me to go, I have a really, really long way to go, and I hope I get way more mature and way calmer as, 40 years from now, but the day-to-day things add up so quickly and make such a big difference. And I compare it to, if I can get just a heartbeat's worth of time to think about how I want to respond to something before before I react, like that's not a ton of time, but it makes such a huge difference. And so the more kind of curiosity I can bring to every day and humor too and go, okay, well, I mean, this isn't a good example right now, but with clients, I'm always saying, "All right, you're going home for Thanksgiving.
Mm-hmm.
Like, how are you going to screw it up? Like, who are you going to be pulled into a fight
Right.
with, or who are you going to avoid, right?" And to say, "Well, okay, what's a small victory this year?
Right.
Can you do something a little bit different?" Um, I think it's really fascinating to see how quickly it adds up. It's a big maturity is a big scale, but the distance between one point and the other is pretty big too. And so if I'm thinking of it as like a scale, right, and I'm like a 16, getting to 17 in a year is a pretty big difference. So
Right.
it adds up, and every day just saying, how's my anxiety running the show, and how do I want to be add a little bit more self, a little bit more
Mm-hmm.
thoughtfulness to my life, a little bit, can I be a little bit more driven by my principles, by my beliefs, instead of just trying to look good and impress everybody and calm everybody down all the time. That's what we're all trying to do.
Yeah, I know I said that was gonna be, like, my last question, but I actually have one more for you, which is just
Sure.
like, let's say we get really good at doing this work long term. Like, let's say, your book has had a huge influence on me and kind of the way I think about these things, and, like, let's say I do get more mature, I do get better at interrupting my autopilot and kind of doing a lot of the tactics here. What's, like, the anxiety end game? Like, what does life look like post-anxiety for those of us who, like, really can't imagine, you know, any other way of being, if that makes sense?
Well, I think of it as two components. One is to be able to separate your thoughts from your reactivity, your emotions, right? So when you are up against something really scary or overwhelming, to know your own mind a little bit and to not just be completely overwhelmed by the feeling part of it. Which is pretty great.
Yeah.
The better you can do that. And the second piece of it is to not be as affected by other people's
Mm,
anxiety and other people's stuff, and that makes for such better relationships, to be able to visit your family and not feel like you're allergic to
mhm.
everyone, to be able to have really, intimate romantic relationships, friendships,
Yeah.
to be in an office where everyone is just very worked up and to be calmer than everyone else. I mean, that all of those things make it absolutely worth it, and I think we need other people to survive, but we don't have to match their level of freaking out,
Mhm.
right? Their
Yeah.
anxiety. And that a little bit of that separation is just is really good.
Awesome. Yeah, it sounds nice. And
I
maybe
know,
we'll get
right?
there someday.
Maybe I hope so.
Yeah. Alright, well, thank you so much, Kathleen. I wanna, leave a moment here to plug your book and your newsletter if you'd like to do that.
Yeah, so my book is called Everything Isn't Terrible: Conquer Your Insecurities, Interrupt Your Anxiety, and Finally Calm Down. And you can buy it wherever you buy books. It's in ebook and audio book as well. And my newsletter, you can just go to my website, which is kathleensmith.net, and you can sign up. It's a free weekly newsletter I write about anxiety, and it's called The Anxious Overachiever.
Awesome. Personally, I highly recommend both. I can't say enough how much I love your writing and how much it's helped me. So, thank you so much for that,
Thank you.
Kathleen.
I appreciate that.
Yeah, and thank you for
Yeah.
making the time today. This has been awesome.
Yeah, I love talking about this. I never get tired of it.
All right. Well, thank you so much. And that's it for today. For those of you who want to learn more about ways to cope with anxiety or want to read up on the dangers of a national mental health crisis, I've provided links to Kathleen's work and a couple of news stories on the subject in the show notes. And really quickly, I just wanted to take a moment to acknowledge the extended hiatus that Overthinking It has been on. If anyone was wondering, that 8-month break between podcast episodes was not planned. But while I've been away, I've been looking at ways to improve the audio quality and the overall user experience of the show. And now I'm returning with a really renewed look at the podcast's future and the topics that I feel prepared to overthink with you. So fingers crossed, I'm planning to bring you many more thoughtful and hopefully helpful episodes this year. You can subscribe to Overthinking It on SoundCloud, YouTube, or wherever you listen to it if you'd like to get updates on future episodes. Thanks, everyone. Till next time.